guidelines for this morning. If you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat and we'll address it. We're going to try to stick very closely to our 30-minute window. I am Dr. Sandy Morgan, and Derek Marsh, the Associate Director of the Global Center for Women and Justice, is also on this video call. And our guest today is Adjunct and Live to Free coach, Ruthi Hanchett. Ruthi has a long history in combating human trafficking and has been a great facilitator for youth-empowered peer-to-peer prevention. And so having her as our guest today, I don't want to take any time away. We're going to turn it over to her right away. So Ruthi, take it away. I think we're going to share your screen, and I would like to advise those of you who don't already have it set up that you go to the top of your screen to view options and click on side-by-side mode. Then you can grab the handle and make it as big or small as you want of your screen to see the PowerPoint. All right, take it away, Ruthi.
Well, thank you so much, and it's such an honor. You said our guest, but it feels like home. Global Center has been a home for me for nearly 8 years now. I've been serving on the board, but also as the coach for the Live to Free students at Vanguard University. We're the group that goes out to the high schools and the community to share about human trafficking in peer-to-peer engagement and education. And I've been teaching Human Trafficking 101, basically an introduction class for undergraduate students for the last, it'll be 5 years now. So today that's really what we're doing. We're getting sort of a 30-minute version of the class I would teach at Vanguard University. And so it's a quick little dive into the issue. It's not meant to go into a lot of detail in all the topics because we teach on this for a long time, but it's just to be an introduction and hopefully encourage you to continue to keep learning more. So I'll speak for about 30 minutes. I encourage you to use the chat to ask any questions. If it's something quick that I can address about the content we're discussing, we'll do it throughout the conversation, or else I'm willing and happy to stay on after 8:30 to talk in depth and further on any issues that you might have. So welcome to class, students. We're gonna get started. The first topic I wanted to kind of look at is some images of what you might see when you think about human trafficking. I did a Google search of human trafficking, and these are some of the images that popped up. So I want to ask you, my students, to comment in the chat. When you look at these pictures, these images, what sort of messages do you get? What would you learn from this Google search about human trafficking? I want to give you a minute. Just put a word or phrase in the chat here. And I can see those. Horror, yeah. It looks scary. Girls are the only ones that might be impacted. It's disturbing. Yeah. We might assume that victims look like this. Only little girls, only white little girls. That they have chains around them, poverty. Yeah. There's a lot of information we might get from these images, but unfortunately, a lot of it is false. The reality is that most human trafficking victims are not bound by chains. They're not hiding in basements. It's not restricted to only little girls. Really, a lot of this information can be not only false, but harmful when we are seeking to understand this issue and to really help the true victims of human trafficking and modern day slavery. So sometimes it helps us to look at what it is not in order to then dive into what human trafficking really looks like. And that's what I want to do this morning, is talk about how do we know the real true science, how do we better identify victims, and then how do we help them. So I want to look at kind of in context of the global picture. What is human trafficking and how does it fit within this historical context to help us better understand what we're looking at today? So when we look at the basic facts of human trafficking on a global scale, we realize that really human trafficking is a modern expression of slavery, right? And unfortunately, slavery is nothing new. Since we've had a written record of human history, since we've written down and used language, we've always written about slavery. So slavery is unfortunately something that's been a part of human history, human society from the beginning. But there's some very interesting and awful things about what this modern expression of human trafficking looks like today that I want to talk about. And so the first thing that's really unique and different about this new expression of human trafficking and modern day slavery is the sheer numbers of slaves. Unfortunately, in our world today, the UN estimate and the most commonly accepted estimate is that there are 40 million slaves in our world today. That's more than any other point in human history. I live in California. That's more than the population of California. 40 million people that are bound by psychological chains, by debts, by threats of violence, that cannot leave or walk away from their situation of exploitation and abuse. And part of the reason that that number is so large is because there are just more humans on the earth today, right? With nearly 7 billion people on the planet, there are more people. And so the percentage of the population might be smaller, but in places like North Korea and India, the percentage of that national population can be as high as 4% or even 2%. And I think we would all agree that any slaves in the world today is too many. So that's something that's unique about the modern expression of human trafficking today. The other thing that is really different about human trafficking today that changes the dynamics is the cost of those slaves. And that influences then the relationship between slave and owner. Now, it might be difficult to go out on the streets of Costa Mesa or Fullerton in California, where I live, and purchase a human being. But in fact, there are places in the world where you can do that. And as many of our kind of early stories of discovering human trafficking describe, that cost is very low. Again, the global estimate for the cost of a human being in the world right now is about $100 US. And when you think about that relationship between what a human being, the price on a life of a human being, and the owner who then controls and owns that person, that means that that relationship is very cheap. It's very tenuous, because when traffickers exploit and abuse their workers for whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, if that person is not performing, if they're not making them a profit, they can quickly discard them and find another. And that has a lot to do with the fact that so many people are living in poverty and in vulnerable situations throughout the world. And most slaves are enslaved because of things like debts, because of abuse and violence, and because of even coercive relationships. So really that cost of a human being is very low in our global economy today, and it means that they're exploited and abused for their labor. And one of the ways that that happens is through this issue of globalization. So globalization is what connects us as human beings around the globe. It's our fast internet, it's our easy travel and airplanes and other forms of transportation. It's our movement of products from one country or region to another. That globalization is a modern phenomenon which helps in many ways our societies and improves our lives, but it also means that exploitation and abuse of human beings is facilitated and made easier, because traffickers can move their victims from one place to another to exploit and isolate them. That can mean that they move them around for the purpose of exploitation, for quote unquote moving their product to be abused and purchased. It also means that the products that we buy as consumers can be produced and made and sold to us by people who are involved in slave labor or exploitation. So it means that I in Fullerton can go to the grocery store and possibly purchase bananas that were picked by slaves in Bolivia, or I may find that my cell phone has a battery that was the minerals were mined by slaves in the Congo. Because of globalization, it means that we in the global economy inadvertently participate in the exploitation and the abuse of others. The other thing about globalization, mentioned the internet, is that unfortunately, it means that the sexual exploitation and abuse of children, women, and men can be documented and distributed throughout the globe. So gender inequality has always had a role in the sexual exploitation and slavery of women and children especially. But now what's different is because of the internet, pornography is oftentimes made of the rape and sexual abuse of women and children especially. and that may be consumed by people around the globe without their ever even knowing that the person on the other side of the screen is a slave and is being abused. So those are some of the really negative ways that this modern expression of human trafficking and modern slavery really is manifest today. But one thing that's different about today's form of slavery that's a very good thing is that it's no longer illegal. We are fortunate that there are laws against human trafficking and slavery internationally and in every country around the globe. The challenge now is really enforcing those laws and holding leaders accountable and law enforcement to be accountable and trained to recognize it and respond appropriately. 200 years ago, the job was to convince the world that we needed to end human trafficking, end slavery, and create laws to protect people. We now have those laws. We don't have that same fight, but we do need to find ways to enforce them and fight corruption that prevents us from doing that. So in our classes at Vanguard University, it's really critical that we learn some of our definitions and our language. Language is really important to define what's really happening and then to make changes about it. So I wanted to give you a briefing on some of the language that's most common in our community in this movement to end human trafficking. And the first is that, again, we talked about kind of historical expressions of slavery, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, we saw this movement to begin to create laws and formalize definitions around human trafficking. So our first international law against human trafficking, we looked to the UN protocol to prevent and suppress and punish trafficking in persons. And this international law was signed in Palermo, Italy, so we oftentimes refer to it as the Palermo Protocol. And this is really the beginning of the international agreement and work towards addressing human trafficking that happened in 2000. And that same year, 2000, the United States also enacted our first law defining and outlining how we would fight human trafficking, as well as the resources and the response that we would provide for victims of human trafficking. And that law in the United States is called the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And that law is reenacted and reauthorized with additional funding and updates and changes every few years here in the United States. So those are really critical policies for us as we fight human trafficking and better understanding kind of the global and collective efforts of the community to address this issue. And usually when we talk about human trafficking, we talk about really two distinct forms, at least in the United States. Our law defines sex trafficking and then breaks that down from labor trafficking. So sex trafficking would be anytime an adult is compelled to enact a sex act for purchase for commercial gain when there's use of force, fraud, or coercion. However, as we'll talk about even further later, anytime a child under the age of 18 is induced to any kind of commercial sex act, there is no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion because children cannot consent to being used in these ways. And because they are minors, any child that's used in any form of commercial sex is considered by our US law as a sex trafficking victim. Now we talk also about labor trafficking. And unfortunately, even though it doesn't get as much attention oftentimes in the media, or even from oftentimes our law enforcement, because it is a difficult topic to investigate and understand, labor trafficking is much more common around the globe. In fact, we estimate that most people who are in modern slavery are engaged in some form of labor trafficking or exploitation and abuse through the work that they do, where another person is profiting off of their work. This can include, and again, in the US, we talk about use of force, fraud, or coercion to induce someone to work. It's where someone is working, but someone else is benefiting and making money off of that. And then we at the Global Center, we talk about child sex trafficking. Children are exploited for many of the same reasons as adults for both labor trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, but we like to use the term commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC is the acronym, because it more accurately describes the ways that children experience abuse and the fact that it's done for the purpose of someone else making money off of the sexual abuse of children. So unfortunately, in early days of the movement, you would sometimes hear people speaking about terms like child prostitute or other terms that are more degrading. And we really like to acknowledge the importance of talking about children are the ones who are experiencing exploitation and abuse, and it's usually adults that are profiting off of that are the traffickers. And so we want to put the onus on those that deserve it, as well as recognize the victimization of children and not blame them when they're involved in this form of abuse. So this image helps us better understand, again, when we break down the US law especially and want to define what human trafficking is, how it fits within our legal definition. We look at three things. We look at the action, as in what happened in order for a crime to take place. How was a person, whether they were induced or recruited, harbored, transported to be used in exploitation. We look at the means, as in how did that act happen? How did someone get coerced into selling commercial sex or working without pay? What was used against them to create that act, that outcome? And then in the US law especially, we look at the outcomes, the purpose. Was it for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation or the purpose of labor trafficking and services that were exploited from a person? So in order to legally define human trafficking and look at specific cases, we look at this AMP model, we call it, the actions, the means, and the purpose. And really when we think about like the actions, one of the easiest ways to create and to force someone into a situation of labor trafficking or sex trafficking really is to offer them a job. So when we talk about recruiting, it's often a fraudulent job. And then things like harboring, transporting, those may happen, but it's also important to remember that with human trafficking, we do not have to move anyone in order for them to be a victim of human trafficking. The very first case I ever heard of a human trafficking survivor when I was in college was a survivor shared her story about being sold by her own parents as a child in her home for commercial sexual exploitation. So we oftentimes, again, going back to those media images, there can be confusion or myths about the fact that this idea that victims have to be moved or brought to a new country to be exploited there. But really, while that does happen, victims can be exploited in their own homes, in their own communities. The question comes down to, is force used against them? Is fraud, that's the promise of a job that doesn't turn out, or some kind of promise that isn't true, tricking someone, or coercion. And coercion can take on a lot of different forms. In the United States, I think it most often looks like romantic relationships and that turn into abusive, exploitive relationships. It can also look like debts, where someone comes to the United States to work off a debt that they may have even agreed to, but then once they're here, their labor is exploited and they're taken advantage of. And then the force and that kind of coercion can often look like threats of force, both to an individual, but also to their family and people that they care about. And that is really the key of looking at what are the means, how does one get someone to work without pay, to sell commercial sex without being compensated or against their will. It really comes down to the means to help us understand how exploitation and human trafficking happens. But again, I want to emphasize that anytime we are talking about minors, when we're talking about children, our law, both internationally and in the United States and even in California where I live, is really clear that minors cannot be, there's no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion with a minor because they cannot legally consent to commercial sex. They can't even legally consent to the labor and exploitation because of laws that protect children from working. So we don't have to emphasize how or to what degree they were forced. Any child who's used in any form of commercial sexual exploitation, whether it's pornography, sugar dating, commercial sexual exploitation, prostitution, they are all victims of human trafficking. I'm going to just give us a minute. I'm seeing some chat, and it's a strange situation to be talking without getting any feedback. So I'm going to look here, and there's some comments about labor exploitation, and even Epstein and his conspirators offering model jobs as a way of recruiting. Absolutely. We hear those stories a lot. Again, the easiest way for a trafficker to bring in a victim oftentimes is to offer a job, whether that's a real job that then turns into one where they're not paid appropriately or they're not treated well, or even the promise of a job that never actually happens. So does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, question about sugar dating. This is a topic that I'm still learning a lot about, but something we see emerging as a trend, which sugar dating, you've probably heard the term sugar daddy or sugar baby. And it's this relationship that is really glamorized right now, where you can find websites where older men will go looking for younger girls, and the idea is that they enter into an adult mutually beneficial relationship where the older men offer experiences, help pay for rent, take them shopping, buy them things, maybe even pay for their college debt. But unfortunately, it sets up this very unequal relationship and power dynamics where oftentimes the older men will then exploit the younger girls. It's usually a lot of these websites are aimed at college-age students and younger. It also is becoming a place where commercial sexual exploitation is absolutely happening. So prostitution is being advertised by sex traffickers, advertising their product, their women and girls especially, to be sold for sex. It's also this, again, sets up this dynamic of women and girls, oftentimes much younger, in financial need, looking to older men with power and money to provide for them, and that imbalance of power oftentimes leads to exploitation and abuse, and then can even transition to sex trafficking. So I'm seeing some comments. I'm sure we can talk more about that, but that is a trend we're seeing on college campuses and even high schools. And it's something that we as Live to Free, the club that I coach of college students, we're starting to talk about that more and more, because we're seeing it as a trend and a problem in a way that especially young people are being exploited. So again, this is a list of some of the ways that human trafficking is manifest. We talked about labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and then child trafficking is right in the middle. Our law legally defines these and separates them, but the truth is that oftentimes victims may be exploited in both ways. But these are some of the ways that one might see human trafficking and exploitation happening typically, especially here in the United States. But like I said, someone who might be working in the labor trafficking side of domestic service, someone who might be working in a home, perhaps performing domestic chores, especially she, because it's oftentimes women, may also be being sexually exploited. So victims may not fall into one specific category so neatly, but when we think about the laws and kind of the way that we see these issues manifest, sexual exploitation can include things that are both legal in our society and illegal. So people can be forced into pornography, but they also may be exploited in prostitution, which is illegal in the United States in most places. We would put the sugar dating in that category as well, as a way that women and girls especially can be exploited, and boys, I should say, and men exploited through sexual exploitation. Forced labor, if you go to the far end, we see that these are some of the common ways that we see most victims being exploited. Again, domestic service in the United States, we've been seeing it happening in childcare and nursing homes. Peonage and debt is really one of the most common ways that people throughout the globe are exploited in labor trafficking, when a family member might take out a small debt and then because of that be forced to work that debt off. But unfortunately, sometimes that debt is handed down even through generations. And when you combine that with lack of education and understanding, even the literacy skills to read the contract of the debt that one might be signing, that turns into a way that communities can be exploited. And then we look at state-imposed labor, but also just any form of manual labor is where we see a lot of exploitation showing up around the globe. And the number one way that victims are exploited in labor trafficking right now is agricultural work. When you think about it, most of the people in the world spend a lot of their time and energy securing food. And so people are exploited in the foods that we purchase in our global economy, but also locally as well. But other ways that are listed there is forms of exploitation. And then children are exploited for some of the same reasons that adults are exploited. They may be exploited for labor, they may be exploited for sexual exploitation, but unfortunately they're also exploited for some reasons that are very specific to the fact that they are children. So for illegal and fraudulent adoptions, sometimes children are specifically recruited as child soldiers, or even to work in mines or rug weaving factories. Because of their small bodies, their small fingers are more able to do the work that's required of them. And I see that Adrian is bringing up the issue of transgender people being overrepresented in human trafficking. Thank you, Adrian, for that. Absolutely. And so I think that, again, is another category of or a population of people that we want to be absolutely looking for and protecting, and looking at the issues that they're experiencing. When it comes to sexual exploitation especially, we see that transgender people are exploited more often, and even explicitly on purpose in many of these areas because of demand. But then we also look at the fact that they can be exploited in forced labor oftentimes because of discrimination and lack of opportunities in economic areas, other economic opportunities. They oftentimes can be exploited and forced into labor situations as well. Thank you for bringing up that point. So we've looked at kind of the ways that people are exploited in human trafficking and some of the legal definitions. This is just to give us a bigger picture of the global picture of where slavery is happening. And the point of this image is really to say that it's happening throughout the globe. At the beginning, I shared that up to 40 million people is around the estimate of the numbers of slaves that we expect to be in our world today. And that is happening throughout the world. But you can see some of the areas that are more brighter colored blue is where we see the greatest experience of that, which would be sub-Saharan Africa, and throughout Asia is where you have the highest absolute numbers of people in slavery. But even in places like the United States, we still experience and have victims of slavery. So there is no country that's immune to it. And I wanted to just touch on the fact that it's happening here in the United States as well as California and Orange County. We know that in 2018, there were 23,000 survivors identified here in the United States. And California, where I live, and I know many of you are calling in from other places, but California leads the way in the number of cases, at least those that are identified and cases that are being worked. We're the highest state. In Orange County, where I live, and where many of us where the Global Center is located, we are one of the top counties of our state because of a lot of reasons, but especially due to proximity to our borders, to the ports of entry here between Mexico and other countries, but also the affluence and the tourism culture here in Orange County means that victims are brought here from other places. So we, Orange County, are on a route that one of the trends we're seeing right now is victims are being brought from the Central Valley of California, where it's very much small towns and agriculture, are being brought to Orange County, LA County, San Diego, Las Vegas, and other places, rotated on a route to be exploited because unfortunately people here are purchasing, especially sex from victims here in Orange County. And if you look at just our information, this comes from our Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force annual report. We find that last year, 2018, that we helped and identified and helped 415 victims here in Orange County. And this is a breakdown where you see kind of an image, a picture of who those victims were, just some of their general information. We see both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Here in Orange County, the victims we're assisting are mostly female and mostly domestic, people from the United States, and mostly in situations of sex trafficking. And you can find more of those details on the Orange County Task Force website. I can see that report is listed there on the chat. But just to remind us that these are the victims that are found and identified and helped. It's not necessarily the bigger picture of all the victims, because oftentimes it's what we're looking for is what we find. And so this is especially what our law enforcement is focused on finding, and it's oftentimes the people that are the easiest to identify that are found and helped. This is just, I wanted to share a list of human trafficking risk factors. And each person has many different factors, and there's no one person that is most likely to be a victim, and no person is even immune or risk-free. But these are some of the more common risk factors or high ways that we can look at vulnerable populations that we can particularly be looking to protect. And these are overlapping in the sense that oftentimes they compound. So a person who is young but also experiences racial inequality and systematic discrimination may be at greater risk. But then if you add in history of abuse or exploitation in their personal lives, that person becomes even higher at risk. And you know, when I talk to my students, we always talk about risk factors and vulnerabilities and populations that are more vulnerable, and the importance of focusing on them in order to protect them and to build resilience. But it's also critical to know that these same people are absolutely powerful to address human trafficking. And so we don't want to look at just the deficiencies, the things that makes someone vulnerable, but also the things that build resilience and the power that they have to overcome these difficult things and to speak out and be abolitionists as well. So while it's important to identify and look at these things, I also don't want us to be stuck thinking that, that there's not power in the people that they represent. So at our Global Center, when we teach our students about how to address these issues and this bigger picture of human trafficking, we like to focus on what we call the 4 Ps or the 5 Ps, which is really the collective community, the anti-trafficking community's most strategic approach to addressing human trafficking. And these are the ways that we are looking as a community to fight against human trafficking. We really look at this bigger picture of how we can come together collectively as a group to address exploitation. And it begins with looking at some of those risk factors also lead to prevention. How do we identify victims or most likely to groups that are most likely to be victims and build strength around them to prevent them from ever becoming exploited? We also look at protection, which is really the aftercare response to working with survivors, to identify them, helping them leave their abusive situations, and then walking on that journey where they come to healing and wholeness. We look at prosecution, which is really the law enforcement. How do we hold traffickers accountable and investigate cases? And then finally, the Global Center especially focuses on policy, both from international to local laws and approaches to address human trafficking. And all of this is held together with a commitment to partnership, to working together, realizing that no one organization or even industry or discipline can address this problem alone, but we all must work together. And as a teacher, when I work with my students, some students will identify and gravitate towards one area or the other more than the other. But I think the importance is to know that we all have a part to play, whether it's as a career or as a volunteer or someone who is just joining this movement. We can all have an important role to play as we work together in partnership to address human trafficking. So that's what I want to focus on ending our conversation is really about what can you do? And as you think about those 5 Ps, those different areas that you can be engaged with, I know there are some that are going to be more natural for you to be engaged with, but here's some suggestions that we have for you. And the first is simply to keep learning. I know a lot of you are podcast listeners you shared, and there are so many free, over 225 free podcasts from the Global Center, Ending Human Trafficking podcast. Keep learning, keep listening, and then teach others what you've learned. But also, you probably know the Global Center for Women in Justice offers online certificates and courses that you can take as an adult to continue learning about human trafficking. So I want to encourage you to think about doing that. But once we learn more, I really encourage people to become a more conscientious consumer. So that means looking at ways that the purchases you make a difference, learning about where your products come from, who made your products, and how you can be part of disrupting that process so that instead of purchasing from someone that may be exploited, instead we use our money and our purchases to vote for the things that we care about through fair trade and ethically sourced products that really share our values and vote for the value and the well-being of others. I think another important piece in the middle is really about supporting efforts at prevention. We talked about really how do we support some of those more vulnerable groups and really prevent them from ever being vulnerable to human trafficking. And one way that you can do that is through investing in the lives of youth in your community, identifying those vulnerable youth and really building their resilience and their empowerment so that they are not victims of human trafficking, but really can become abolitionists and speak out and protect others against it. We talked about a little bit about the harms of commercial sex, and I think understanding the connection between all forms of commercial sex, exploitation, and sex trafficking, we can begin to make a difference in the demand that exists in our community by refusing to purchase commercial sex, but also speaking out about the harms that it causes to our culture and society and the individuals involved in it. And then I want to encourage anyone who wants to volunteer with the Global Center for Women and Justice, but also our Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force and other organizations that are fighting human trafficking is a great way to begin to make a big difference in this effort to address human trafficking. And finally, I coach the Live to Free youth group at Vanguard University. We go out to high schools, junior highs, and right now we're doing it virtually on Zoom. So if you have young people in your life, in your high school and your youth group and even just your kids and their peers, we would love to bring a peer-to-peer educational opportunity for your young people to learn about human trafficking, to be empowered to know what it is and also fight against it. And finally, I have to always share the National Human Trafficking Hotline. For many of you, it should be familiar, but knowing that there is this hotline that's 24/7 with language translation and services ready, this is the most important thing I think we can do is know this hotline, save it in our phones, and pass it on to others, especially anyone that you think may be at risk, to let them know that there is help available and encourage them to call this number. I also mentioned the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force here. For any of you who are local here in Orange County, the national hotline connects to our Orange County resources where then individuals are supported in the aftercare, especially as they come out of trafficking situations. So I will stop there because I think I've run out of time, and I want to see if there's any questions that are left and any issues we want to dig into, but that is all the presentation I have for now. So I'm seeing some amazing comments about what people are doing. I love it. And there's a question about branching out and extending our peer-to-peer education through Live to Free. Well, yes, we are trying to do that right now through the online Zoom opportunities that we have for our students to speak to larger audiences. We're going to be doing an event on July, I think it's the 23rd. I hope I got that date right. We can follow up with that, an online event to train and teach other young people about human trafficking and especially online safety during this time of COVID. But we've been doing some really great partnerships in the last few years too with high schools here in Orange County to expand and go in greater depth with high schoolers to help them become trained and aware and engaged in fighting trafficking in their communities and high schools. Okay, one question is about why are there less labor trafficking investigations? And the thing, I think the biggest challenge with labor trafficking is it's much more difficult to investigate and to prove. And the main thing is that it's easy to see a child, a 16-year-old selling commercial sex. We know that that's illegal. We know that she's a victim. Labor trafficking on its surface looks like legal activity, right? Someone washing your dishes, someone working in a nursing home, someone cleaning a home or working in a nail salon it can appear to be legitimate work. So it takes much more long-term investigation, proving that there's force, fraud, or coercion, that there's some kind of debt, some kind of exploitation happening in order to verify that it is trafficking rather than just a low-wage job or even what we oftentimes see is people being paid less than our laws would regulate. So, but oftentimes because they are undocumented or because they lack documentation and status, they may be working at a lower wage, but be afraid to come forward or even to leave that job because of their lack of documentation, their fear of deportation. So those issues are very complex to better investigate. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of our law enforcement, our local police, that's not highest on their priority, and they may not even be trained on how to do that sometimes. So I'm seeing some questions about COVID-19, especially with children. So I know we've got, Sandy's putting up that there was a COVID-19 podcast done, but I think it is important to know that one of the things that we're seeing especially is just people are stuck at home, they're online. That means that there's greater opportunity for traffickers to exploit. One of the trends we're seeing is that traffickers can even take advantage and exploit children without even ever physically being present with them. So whether it's through sexting, asking for graphic sexual images and then using that as blackmail or coercion, or even selling sometimes that image or kind of sexual activity online in webcams and things like that, that can be a way that young people are exploited right now, which is really hard. I mean, parents may not even know that it's going on with their young people. So it's really critical that we as adults and as parents talk to children, talk to your teens about safety online, about the risks, but also how to stay safe and how to use the tools that they have to be connected to people that they know are safe and not fall into tricks of traffickers and exploitation. And yeah, NetSmarts is listed here because they have great resources for parents. Great apps, and it's really, really helpful. I'm seeing there's other online training for parents. Even just there's a lot of apps that help parents better understand and monitor what their young people are doing online. I think starting those open conversations is so critical.
Ruthi, there was a question about how you, as somebody who's studying the issues, can kind of not be overwhelmed, and how you can be studying the issues and in this fight for the long haul, because it's easily overwhelming and it takes an emotional toll. So how have you personally tried to navigate that sticky road?
Well, for me, I think I get a lot of hope from the survivors that I do know. I am fortunate in this work, I'd say, to be able to build relationships with people who have overcome, and really many of them are now the authorities, the trainers, the educators, the speakers that are really informing us in the community about how to address human trafficking. And that resilience to me is so inspiring and encouraging that that really does keep me going especially when you're confronted with the horror or the tragedy of an individual life that's been abused and exploited. I also know people who have come out on the other side, and that is really encouraging. I also love that I get to work with young people. So I get to work with the Vanguard students, and they are so creative in the way that they address this issue. And they are passionate and excited about the work, but they also think really deeply and take it to heart. And I've seen them just grow and change as individuals as they make personal commitments to fighting this issue and to really changing society, with the choices they make, the lifestyles they choose to live. To me, it's really encouraging that they're taking this on, and then that I think will lead to systemic change in the future. So it's both at an individual level, but also as a cultural, societal level, I see change happening, and that's really positive and encouraging to me.
Thank you so much, Ruthi. And what a great ending, inspiring the next generation. That's why I love being at Vanguard University and working with students. Our alums are doing the work on the front line everywhere, internationally, nationally, right here in California and right here in Orange County.